Okay, now we are recording. Okay, so thank you for coming to the first episode of Coronavirus War Room. This is a concept for ones that haven't heard about it. It was something that George and I were talking about on, I think it was the previous recording that we did. And the idea is to have this a kind of a regular thing. I'd have guests on talking about different current events dealing with the coronavirus. So George, thank you for coming. Kevin, thank you for coming. And let's start, George, with your what happened with CNN and your interview there.
Great, thanks, Paul. Well, the first thing is, before I forget, is I do want to get into talking with Kevin about nanobodies and this clotting thing and that whole nanobodies versus antibodies and all that. So, which is very fascinating. This whole different presentation that's going on that's neurological. But he's the expert. But as far as CNN, I had an interview. I recorded it on my channel. This is a guy who kind of did a hit piece on me 3 years ago, called me a conspiracy theorist, etc. Blah blah blah. And I recorded the call, and I just recorded all the things that I had accumulated in terms of evidence before he called, just so that he couldn't say that there wasn't this body of information, facts, basically, that, you know, leaning toward this bioweapon, or at least playing with nature so that it could be misconstrued by some other party as a bioweapon in the lab. You could have 100 researchers all trying to do biodefense, but if you have one person who wants to misconstrue it as bioweapon, then it becomes a bioweapon. So that hasn't, I don't know that article's come out yet. My response is out before the article because I was commenting all along, and I wanted to see that I wanted to show how CNN very selectively takes little sound bites and doesn't report the whole story, which is what they did 3 years ago with me. The New York Times had an article about me similar. So yesterday, there's been 4 articles in the last 2 weeks or so. One was Vice News, one was Forbes. Yesterday, National Review also wrote an article about the early days of the virus outbreak in Wuhan, maybe going back to October or early November. And again, I was mentioned as a key piece of the article. So lots of stuff happening there. But I have your attitude and Dr. McCairn's attitude, which is, I'm not going to worry about the backbiting and the ankle biting right now. It's all hands on deck to share as much information as possible.
Could I just ask the muckraking they did on you before? You said they were sort of trying to play gotcha with you previously.
Yeah, well, I think this whole labeling somebody a conspiracy theorist, and all I'm doing is
very dangerous.
Yeah, well, and there was this FBI informant involved, which I won't go too much into this, but the transportation agency that moves these bioweapons and biopathogens had this kind of little tiny Farsi company moving all these things around in the United States. That was a family business. That half of them spoke Russian and all of them spoke Farsi, going to Columbus, Ohio, back and forth to the port of Baltimore. And I was going to Ohio trying to find out why is it not getting to Ohio? Something's falling off the truck of this company called Transport Logistics. That's just follow the money, follow the stuff that falls off the truck. And you could tell I hit a sore spot because it just was, oh, this is total conspiracy theory. No, it's bills of lading, it's purchase orders, it's press releases, it's websites and so forth. So, and I think it's if there is a dark weapons game going on here, a bioweapons game going on, which I certainly believe this little trucking company was in the business of doing, I could see why they would.
They might not have known that though.
Yeah, they might not.
Well, so, just to interject a bit, you know, even though it was small fry what I was doing compared to CNN, I had a very similar thing happen to me when the Crimson, the Harvard Crimson called me, and they contacted me, the reporters from there, and they said, well, we've heard, this was early on, this was in February. they were hearing about my stance on the bioweapon, or at that time bioengineered virus. All right, I was saying it was still scientific. I didn't know about Fort Detrick until I learned about your work, George. But in my stance with Dr. Lieber, saying that he was a traitor. So they were trying to make a hit piece on me.
Sure.
And I recorded, I told them that I was, recording the conversation. They were recording my end. I was recording their end. And we went into detail, as we talked earlier, the probability of it, the how they engineered the virus, the papers that showed how they were engineering the virus, the bioinformatic aspect of it. They all triangulated to a certain conclusion, which was that it was human engineered. It wasn't
Right.
zoonotic. All right. And then we started talking about the geopolitical, parts of this, with the 1,000 talent plan. Well, they decided at first they were at first they were going to go, well, this is what the experts are saying, and this is what this crazy student from Harvard saying. That's how they were going to frame it. And then I was like going, no, you got, if you want to be honest, you got to frame it with both. If you have scientific people out there, quote, the experts saying that it was zoonotic, then you have to show equal time on the piece. So they dropped the article.
Yeah.
All right. They just flat out dropped the article and didn't do it. But I released the recording on my channel. So if anyone wants to hear it, you can, the Harvard Crimson recording with the actual journalist. And I was begging him on the show, or on that recording, that, hey, you don't really understand how this is going to change the university. The university is going to lose money. They're going to shut down the universities because of the contagion. You could see that I was just like so ahead of the game in terms of how it was going to change the landscape of Harvard. And the guy just like, oh, okay. And then I reached out to him maybe about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I said, you should have published. You would have been so ahead of the game if you just listened.
Right.
Because now all these major news networks are starting to say what we've been saying for months.
Right.
So, but something very similar happened to me, but it was much smaller fry than CNN. But it's interesting in how they try to package us as a conspiracy.
Yeah.
Well, that's classic counter intel type work, and that's been in the pipeline for a long time. And I can remember, the political winds changing when the Obama administration came in, and basically they were looking to project into the future what they thought were going to be the jihadis of the next decade. And that was the right-wing civil sovereign citizen types. And
Right.
and so that basically just covers a good proportion of pretty much the backbone of America, I would say. And that those bits of, I don't know if they're laws as such, but sort of tactical planning was there way before, and that came under the sort of Homeland Security
Right.
umbrella
Yeah.
a long time ago. And I can remember being enraged about it back then, because it seemed to me that if you wanted to agitate, I was trying to sort of get to this earlier as well, and I wasn't sort of framing it very well, but it was, what I was trying to say was I watched how they dismantled the UK in this very technocratic fashion and instantiated what was a surveillance state, right? So everything got ginned up, with crime, everything was this, dystopia unraveling out on the streets. And that just gave them one more excuse to start just putting cameras everywhere. So suddenly in the space of a few years, you went from cameras watching hotspots in front of pubs to everything monitoring like automatic speed cameras. Okay, they weren't allowed to be automatic I remember the legislation being changed, that they said they could do it automatically, whereas before they had to have a witness to it, right? Because that, you know, the idea being that if they're going to testify in court, there has to be someone there to sort of charge you. And at the same time, in the UK, they dismantled the idea of any criminal complaint that you could take to a jury, right? So it would just get handled automatically in the what they called the magistrates courts, and it was nothing. It was just automatic fines, automatic, and they just came after you with respect to money. I remember the same thing happening with, you know, what they would call deadbeat dads. Kids in bed, please. And like I say, I watched that happen, and the US is far, far from that situation right now.
Well, at the country level, but I'm starting to see something like this happen in New York City, where every corner is starting to become surveilled.
And I saw that.
You know, so this is, you know, America, United States is very large, so you're not going to have this in the middle of Oklahoma, but in these major cities, you're going to have this type of surveillance that's very similar to what you see in London.
Well, I mean, it's everywhere in the UK. Even small towns and villages now have speed cameras. Everything's monitoring and tagged. And I just wanted to. There was a story I did see, and I know it's not science, but it sort of touches on what we were speaking. And it's late, and I can't see my Discord button. Great, give me a second, guys. But if you guys want to carry on, whilst I just dig that article up, because I think you find it.
Well, Kevin, what I wanted to say was it's a mosaic, or it's a multi-layered system. So you have cameras. I heard once that there was more cameras in the UK than there were in the United States, all up, which I think is be an interesting thing to see if it's true or not. But
yeah, it's true.
Yeah, but you have a mosaic. So planes can be contracted, small planes, private planes, commercial planes. You have satellite assets, small nanosatellites at low orbit, high orbit. You've got drones. Obviously, with these new surveillance drones are going to be coming forward. I think they already have them in New York and other big cities like LA. So it's definitely rolling out. The next level with the surveillance drone is now being introduced as this response now to this horrible thing that's happening.
But you know, but the thing is like, if you step back and look at it from just a logical, philosophical point of view, with no emotion, who gave them the authority to do this? I don't remember signing some sort of voting on some sort of legislation or anything like this, or you know, in the voter box, you know, saying we'll appropriate our tax dollars to this.
They don't have
right,
to.
right. So they have a rogue element within the government that's just pushing this through, eroding our Fourth Amendment.
I think you're exactly right when you talked about it earlier, saying they're putting in the Bio-Patriot Act now, which is the drone surveillance. You know, that's just going to be a part of life now. And that's got to come. They're going to come back on May 4th here in the United States to Congress, and I think they're going to pass something like that.
Well, like I said, so they can try to pass it, and so this is what I understood from when I lived in the US, that, you know, they can try to pass it, but the citizenry still has the provision to challenge every bit of legislation in the High Court, and an individual can do that if they feel that their constitutional right has been breached. Okay, so so that's why I've sort of held to the line that make them move now, and make them take their best shot, which is this is their best shot right now, right? And then their momentum that sort of takes them past, and they'll overshoot because they can't grab everyone and everything with that one shot. We then see the fallout of that, and then you've got the mechanisms in place to really start challenging that. Okay, so that's where I think the pressure points that be applied at the sort of PSYOP level, because they want to fractionate the idea of the United States that's under the Constitution. So they'll hit those pressure points, the far right groups. You'll become a conspiracy theorist, George. You're already a conspiracy theorist. You've been judged, right?
Yeah.
You're judged. And that's what I was saying to you earlier, Paul. You know, it's all very well to come out with, you know, fire and brimstone, but they know how to deal with this. I've seen it, right?
Yeah.
I've watched it happen, and you know,
I'm thinking that there's a Boston Tea Party moment, you know, where we just throw the tea into the river, you know, and what that is exactly, I'm not really sure yet. But I think that it has a lot to do with women, and I think it has a lot to do with children and that motherly instinct to protect their children. There's a tipping point that's about to be reached, and the government is going to overstep their boundaries, and the mothers are going to protect their children, and they're underestimating the power of that motherly instinct.
And so that happened in, I'm going to say it was Ohio this week, right, where the mother got arrested in the park because, you know, what you're seeing is you're seeing a very blunt tool be applied on a mass scale. So what's trying to be worked for New York, right, where it's a very sort of built up metropolitan area, they know how to sort of handle that. It's just London basically, or you know, if you wanted some sort of similar metric where the laws are similar, right? And so by the time they dismantled the indigenous fabric, right? Because there's indigenous British people, right? And once that got broken apart and all those boroughs got sort of taken over by activist groups, and that's when it really, you know, the vice really started to clamp shut with respect to how they moved the city. Because how the city moved and was how the rest of the country would go. And it was all right saying there'd be stubborn Yorkshire men or what have you, and the Scots will always cause an issue. That didn't happen. Everyone just sort of grumbled on with it because, well, the money issue is imprinted so deeply into the psyche that people will.
You bring up a great point about this. I mean, to force the vaccine program, the way for people to accept E7 is to tie them in financially and say, if you don't do this, if you don't accept these policies, you're not going to get income. Either you don't get a job. We're seeing this with Cuomo. All right. He's already opened up this idea, test for antibodies. If you don't have the antibody, you don't go back to work. Well, how do you get the antibody if you've never been sick? Well, you have to be given a vaccine.
Right.
You know?
You mentioned Vital Strategies, and Vital Strategies is the company that you told me got the surveillance contract for the tri-state area.
Tri-state area. Yeah.
And you're counting New Jersey and Pennsylvania in that area.
Oh, no. I'm counting it per Governor Cuomo's speech. That tri-state area is New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut.
Oh, in Connecticut. Okay, going north. Okay. Well, Tom Frieden, who ran that, is kind of one of these. He was New York Public Health Commissioner, as you know, and then he was a big part of Ebola with the CDC. So he's been working with the CDC a long time. And he has this background with these global health funds and so forth. And it just looks like this is the rollout. You know, the rollout is going to be in New York. They're going to tweak it. Even though they kept the subways running after all the stuff we were talking about, you know, the Javis was being built out and we want the comfort to come up. And they're letting people ride the subways with the handrails. So, you know, so I just didn't get that unless you wanted everybody to get the antibody. But I think watching this Vital Strategy is going to be interesting.
Oh, definitely. And for people that don't know, there are 3 groups that are tied into the idea of tracking people that have the antibody and potentially get sick, contract COVID-19 after the shelter in place. Those 3 groups are Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg LP. That's the Bloomberg's business, and this Vital Strategies. They're all working together to be able to do this tracking. And I think this is the beta test to see how it works. How do they actually do the tracking for the rest of the country? Which I think the next phase of this will be an introduction of some sort of verification mechanism, documentation, whatever that is. Probably it's going to be some sort of database documentation, but eventually it'll push this idea. Well, we have 330 million people that need to be inoculated, roughly, minus the people that have the antibody. And because there's so many, we'll have to tag. We'll have to use some sort of digital tagging on the body to verify, or a digital tag that's tied to your driver's license or passport or something. Maybe that's the first wave. But the bottom line is that they're going to put a number on us.
Yeah, and I think they're going to be a little more subtle. I heard it was going to be quantum dot, other than a chip, and I don't think anybody's going to go for the chip. The quantum dot's more like a tattoo. And I think they're going to be smart about it and let you do a Yankees tattoo or a, whatever Jets tattoo. I don't know anybody who wants a Jets tattoo.
But here's the problem is that within at least the Jewish religion, you're not supposed to have a tattoo on your body.
Right.
That goes all the way, that goes all the way to the, into the Talmud, where it talks about, you stay away from that. Now, the thought was that they didn't have germ theory back then, but there was some thought that people that have tattoos, they have diseases, and well, you can get hepatitis from tattoos if it's not properly done.
The Babylonian captivity, 180 years, where they tattooed slaves. The tribes were the slaves. So that resonates.
So there's a religious component. There's a religious component to this.
Yeah.
So that they know those psychological weak points, right? It's not that these are not unknown variables, and people will. They know to look for that, right? So the fact they're getting in your face right now with drones, right, is just there with drones flying all the time, just high enough that you can't see them. Right. 24 hours a day, right?
Well, let's just put it this way: it's high enough where you can't blow them away with a shotgun.
Right.
But all right.
And, yeah, I mean, even if you could pick it out, there's so much air traffic over the United States that you would it would be virtually impossible, right? Even if, I don't know, you did do something bizarre, I don't know. And look, when I was in the US, they were the FBI were fitting up Muslim lads for by some explosives, and and people will think they'd be able to get a stinger, right? They make them in the US, right? It's not like these things will not be available to people to sort of try and do stuff like that. And I would maybe look for the entity that you're going to go up against. Just so you just say government, because it's a good catch-all. You have to just think of it like a living. It's not living, but it's a entity in the real meaning, right? And it has a sort of
it's an organized structure that there's feedback loops to it, so it kind of grows.
It's like a virus.
Yeah.
It knows how to invade societies.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah.
So I
just want to say one last thing on Kevin's comment about the traffic cameras. I think that he's right. The surveillance is pervasive already, but this now allows you to introduce it in court and introduce drone pictures in court as a way of proving that somebody didn't do the social distancing. And now we're trying to get comfortable with that. Like, the first time we saw a ticket from an auto speed light, like Kevin was saying, it was like, what? Big brother. But then everybody kind of got used to it. And I think this next thing is the drone cameras with pictures introduced in court. But it's just a thought.
See, my worries is that what's going to happen is, especially in New York, there's going to be more and more of these flying down avenues and streets. And it'll have different capabilities where it would be able to see heat signatures, or record audio, and or X-raying or whatever. And so it's going to be able to see through the building and surveil you in your home. Well, I view that as improper search and seizure.
Well, they already have that.
Well, even though that they have, I know they have the technology, but they shouldn't be able to use it. They shouldn't be able to use it because they need a warrant.
So they're already using it, right? So they can
Well, I
get
know
like
that.
those FISA warrants, and then they can do whatever they think they need.
Well, that's why I said we need to roll back to a pre 9/11 day, because the Patriot Act, I think, is unconstitutional.
Right, and so we're counting the days down to when they have to renew the Patriot Act, and that's a couple of months away, right?
But the history in the United States is every time there's a sunset clause, they create a new act that's even worse than the old act. And that's my worry, is that the Bio-Patriot Act is going to be the Patriot Act on steroids, because now it's going to be pushing this whole ID agenda and this forced vaccination agenda.
That's what happened the last time. It got re-upped, and it was supposed to be, we're going to take out the listening to calls and all that with Snowden, and then it just got worse. So, and they'll call it like the Reform Act, but it'll be twice as worse.
Right, exactly.
So, what I was going to say also is spraying. If you have a relatively safe virus like the safe strain of coronavirus, it is a biomarker in and of itself, because I can test for it later. If there truly are a way of varying this thing with 4,000 different strains, I can spray the group in Michigan, and now you don't even know you're breathing, and it's going in, and now you're biomarkered. You were one of those, gun toters or whatever people supposedly are getting characterized, neo-Nazis that protested in Michigan. You were one of those ones that went to the Wisconsin, and now I can look, next time I do a test on you, I can see where you were. It's a kind of a biomarker, and Gates is pushing this biomarker. He has patents in this biomarker thing.
It goes even further, because it's a four base code. You can code within those four bases actually a message.
Yeah.
So you could put in a non-coded region, in the genome of a particular virus, and it's benign. It's like just a common cold thing. You get infected, and if you still have some of that viral load in your body, then you would be biomarkered, and the message is in the code. So if they sequenced it, they would say, "Oh, this person is a dissident from Michigan," because they infected that area with that were protesting. Right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, and so Gates has this patent on this interface.
Right. This guy just is so diabolical. I mean, it's just like, can he really wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and really say that this is stuff that he really wants to do? Or is he kind of pushed to do this? Because I'm wondering, when they were trying to, basically break up his company back in around 2000 or 1999, when he was being investigated, maybe there was a deal that said, we won't break up the company, but you're going to be towing the line later down the road here. And this is the deal that we're seeing here now. Because I have a hard time believing that someone could wake up every morning and be this diabolical.
Well, but you can also get believers, right? He could.
Well, this is like the singularity movement, where they're moving into transhumanism, and they want to be part of the Borg.
Well, I've always
there's a link, Paul. If you could open that, it's a good way of sort of structuring what we're talking about right now. I don't know if you can see that and bring it up on screen.
And I'll just comment on, because I've been dealt with Microsoft a long time, and was up there. He's been a front for Deep State for a long time, way before 1999. 1999 might have been a withdrawal from the Microsoft shareholders to get some of the principal's money out for the fine, the Euro fine, European Union fine. But he's been fronting for, you could even say that DOS was supposed to be a surveillance tool, and it took 7 years to get Windows after Apple had Windows.
All right. All right. So you did a chat. Okay. So you want me to open this up?
So this, I would put forward the premise right now that everything is in place, right? There's no need to think of ever more sophisticated bells and whistles for mass surveillance, right? and it's already being used. It's being trialed in South Korea. That's an ally right now that's on the front line, where they're compliant to this type of ordering, if you like. The Western mind would sort of freak out a little bit about, but the 3G network, 4G network is keeping tabs on you, right? Because you've got you're carrying a phone most places, or you're interacting with machines at some level, whether it's to get you into a building, or you're literally dealing with, for want of a better word, a sort of matrix type
Internet of Things is old news, right? I mean,
yeah,
we connect to everything.
Yeah, I think Paul's just sharing his
Okay.
screen.
All right. This is the first time I tried this within the app here. Okay. So this is okay, go ahead.
I think George is speaking. So,
well, I was just going to say, I've not been on a Zoom when it switches away and it was a gal walking on a beach in a bikini. It had been so long since I've seen that I was shocked.
So Dr. McCairn, what specifically are you referring to in this article?
So how do they know that this fatigue is setting in? So look, they're just tracking mobile data already. They're telling you what they're doing, right? Okay, and it's the same method that they're using in South Korea right now. And they know everyone's got a unique ID number. That's your telephone number. So there was legislation put back when I was in the US that you could change your phone and keep your number, and everyone thought that was a great thing, right?
Yeah, but how do they? I don't understand. How do they know that they're fatigued? They know your number, but
the distance between the phones. They can triangulate a phone. Have been able to do it for years.
No, I get that part, but how do they know that you're fatigued from the quarantine?
Because they can see the relationship between each phone, right? So they can plot average of the distance between, you pick any one phone and then say what's around it on that base station and the other base stations. It's just basic Cartesian coordinates.
Oh, I see. Okay, all right. So you're just saying that people are not following the quarantine. Okay, I get it. I thought they were trying to understand the psyche of the individual that had the
they
phone.
know all
and
that,
like,
dude.
I mean,
I think also the protests, the Michigan protest and the Wisconsin protest, and then we had a protest here in Annapolis at our Capitol. It wasn't one where they got out of the cars, but it was a honking protest, drive-by type. And I think there's more of those going on. So just by managing against the noise level, they're saying, hey, we got to do something. And this may be just the, kind of the primer that they're spraying, and then they're going to let everybody have a summer and then come back. They're already predicting. I mean, a month ago, they couldn't tell us that this thing wasn't something to just ignore. Fauci at the end of February saying it's no big deal. And now they're predicting 4 months in advance that we're going to be hit again. If that's not knowledge of a bioweapon, I don't know what is. We're going to spray you again.
They know exactly, George. They know deep down. They know through their research and what they did that this thing is going to gain function with another receptor, and there's going to be another spike once we let out of shelter in place. So there's going to be reinfection with the current capability of the virus, the current affinity to certain receptors. But there's going to be a gain of function as this thing mutates that they're already predicting. So that's what I'm saying is to say we're not out of the woods yet. When we get out shelter in place, we have to wait until late October to fully understand what's going to happen. Is this going to attenuate and we do see a light at the end of the tunnel, or is it going to be just as virulent as the first wave?
I think they have a lot of vials already prepared. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it could be. That's another take on this, is that there may be other strands that are going to be leaked out to, because what's interesting here is they really did not know how this was going to really operate in the real world. They can simulate it. They can do some testing. but in the lab and in small little, maybe villages or something. But to fully understand how it really propagates through the whole world, this is their quote beta test, right? They did alpha testing, in the lab. Now they may have thought that this was going to be much more virulent. They end up realizing that nature is a lot more robust than they thought, and now they're going to hit us again with something new.
Yeah,
but they'll say it is, well, it mutated.
Yeah.
I would just point to so any sort of predictive modeling that you have, it gets complicated exponentially by already them saying there's multiple strains, and we think there's major degrees of pathogenicity between these multiple strains, and we don't know which is which right now. And so I would, like I say, when I sort of first started speaking publicly, I spoke about, just out of curiosity, because of my line of work, where could I get work? And, in the UK was one of the few places I know that had primates was Porton Down, and that's their bioweapons facility. Now, once I'd sort of took enough interest in the literature to see that, they've done testing on monkeys, and those papers have come out in the last week. I've spoke about them to try to sort of nip in the bud the claims of the no virus people that the virus doesn't conform to Koch's postulates, right? And it does conform, and we demonstrate it in the closest model that we have, macaque. And there's a species difference within macaques as to which is more virulent. So you might find and this is what people are going to have to wrap their heads around, and it's going to blow apart their little fictive realities of we're all one, we're all just the same human being underneath. We're not, right? And it might be that specific strains are more will target different haplogroups differently, right? And so what might be the first wave relatively benign on the rest of the country, you don't know how that second wave, if they're modeling it and you've got bad actors, and you in any sort of planning and counter intel, you always assume that there's a bad actor. Always. You can't not assume. So like I said, when you have a breach of the facility, from 1 to 4, right? You presume it's okay. 1 you don't, but 2, 3, 4. If you have a breach, you presume worse till you know better, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, you're in Japan, and I'm reminded of the cult that spread the ricin attacks on the subway in Japan and killed a whole bunch of people. I can't remember how many it was, but it reminded me.
Was it ricin or sarin? It was sarin attack.
Yeah.
Sarin. Yeah, it was a sarin.
Yeah, I thought there was also a ricin attack by the same cult, but maybe I'm wrong. It's just sarin. But you get the idea. Is all I need to do is, if I'm deep state and I want to create a surveillance state, I just need to develop one cult. I just need one David Koresh or one Jim Jones and 50 people.
Or just Dr. Fauci.
Or just Dr. Fauci. But I'm talking about a real cult.
Right.
Yeah. So, where you just have them all. You just have them all pray together like this Shin Chen Anji, this SCJ. You just have them pack in like sardines, and you can spread the thing from one side of the church to the other in one day. And then you send them all to Wuhan, or you send them all to whatever state opens up, like Georgia has opened up. Send the Korean girls down there, and we can create a breakout anywhere we want if we have 50 of those people.
Yep, and they know this, and this is why I'm trying to ram home the idea that you need to watch this. You have to watch the first, right? If you're going to start sparring with someone, you want to see how they're going to come up to you and sort of dance around you, so you can make a sort of prediction of what you're going to do next, right? So the people and the zombie entities that we have to engage to get them back in the box, you have to say, well, okay, what are they doing? So the idea, we think it's a good hypothesis to go with, that you, you undertake this, you call it beta test, I guess is a fair analogy. I mean, I'm leery of calling it that because it sort of downplays the magnitude of it and the seriousness of it, because I do think there's elements to this that are so unknown, and the spectrum of symptoms so wide, that from a research perspective, I would almost say right now you're looking at multiple agents right now, rather than the
It's not one thing that's mutated. It could be two completely different pathogens. And it's the way of covering. The big move covers the small move. The big safe vaccine covers the small move of a very lethal vaccine. And if you just think about it like cattle, like biowarfare, when they were trying to take out the cattle in Cuba, they just infect a small lot. They get one farmer to inspect a small lot of cows. I think this was done by, Gottlieb and Bissell in Bay of Pigs. Just get one farmer to take them all to market and infect all the, and to me, this Chen Chi, when you told me about it, Kevin, this wacko doomsday cult in South Korea, I just thought, God, it's just like the cattle all being put together. They're preying like sardines. They have to share food. It's a military thing where they're praying 8 hours a day. They have all these military proctors watching over them. And then what do? Over a 10-month period, they go to 5 different continents and add 10,000 church members. And one of them is Wuhan. Well, the biggest place where they did the recruiting is Wuhan. And we're surprised there's a breakout.
Yeah, and look, if you want to sort of map on synchronicities, think about the Asian lady that was grabbing the Pope's hand, right, at Christmas time. I don't know if you saw that, but
yeah, I did. Yeah.
The Pope sort of swatted her away, and it sort of caused a bit of an outrage. But she was hanging on, right, and you could well believe that.
Yeah, I always thought that was kind of weird. That was a weird thing that was going on, and I didn't make the connection when it first happened. I didn't make the connection though that it was maybe a spreading of a disease.
So
Kim Jong-un's brother was sprayed in an Asian airport, I think, by a young lady, and I'm not.
That's right.
And now they say he might be dead now in North Korea, and all you need is just a comfort girl to spray him when he's sleeping or whatever, and it's lights out.
Just spray the comfort girl while she's sleeping.
Yeah, and she doesn't even have to know about it. And as long as she's been given a vaccine. So this cult, you were there in Daegu, and I didn't see it up close, but you saw the building, I think, where they sprayed.
I know Korea well, and I know people that are on the front lines of dealing with this, and all I can really say is they've been professional to the nth degree. Like, if that was my sort of front line operating base, if I was colonel, I'd be pretty chuffed right now with how it was being handled and how the things are sort of panning out right now, I guess. And the things happening to the Korean leadership, the Iranian leadership, and things turning against the Chinese in such a way that other nations are holding them accountable.
Well, do you think that the CCP will, because of this pandemic, will fall? Or do you think they're getting stronger?
No, they will laugh at your lawsuits and they don't care.
Well, I'm not. The lawsuits are meaningless to the CCP. But I'm wondering if internally in the country there's going to be an uprising against President Xi.
You'll see sort of internal power struggles, but it will come under the chances of the Communist Chinese Party going silently into the cold dark night, I think, are minimal, right? And so what I would say, looking at just and this is just my feeling of being here for, I've been places now across the world, and I've had a good look at the nature of things around here. And I think what will happen is there'll be a quid pro quo arrangement, and it's probably already been done. If you're thinking, if we're seeing parts of this event, this emergent event, as we see it, okay, and then so we're saying, we're sort of pointing the finger at gain of function research. We're already finding the telltale signature of it being sort of passed around and put between different players. And like I say, the bomb went off, the dirty hand grenade went off in China's hands. So, it's their foul up at this point, because people will look for, because people need some cathartic release at some level. And so there could well have been something in the trade talks where, this is just me spitballing, but in the trade war, as Trump has gone over to speak to Xi Jinping, and it's not just Xi Jinping, it's speaking to a lot of whatever you want to call them, commissars, I don't know, but they will, he speaks Mandarin. He probably went over there and said, right, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we want. And probably on that bucket list was the Korean leadership, Iranian leadership. We want, if this is your backyard, you have to keep it tidy if you want to play in the game and you want to keep status. And then you say, well, we'll give you your market still, and we'll let you, and at some level the Chinese will go for that, but then they'll say, okay, but in that exchange we want Taiwan back, right? And there might have been a sort of deal made like Hong Kong, right, where there was a sort of a sharing of the administration, if you like.
Hey, George, what do you think? I mean, you think what's especially with North Korea, what's happening with Kim Jong-un?
Well, I always follow the money, and I always follow the joint ventures, and it's very easy when you don't have that in front of you to think of this as a trade level, China versus U.S. and so forth. And I respect what Kevin says very much. Like you said, China was caught with a hand grenade. The hand grenade here is that there's a joint venture with them, and on 4 different levels between Wuhan and this guy who left Fort Detrick, which is this guy named Bavari. He's this Iranian guy. And I look at that and say, during the middle of the travel ban, I look at things that don't make any sense as far as they must require state support. He's flying people back and forth. One of them's nanobodies, which I want to get to, a company called Pro Transit Nanotherapy, which I want to ask Kevin as a neuroscientist. But he's got these 4 joint ventures. He has this level 1 breach at a BSL-4 level lab. He discontinues the courier program, and then he goes into business with himself with these 4 startups to shop all this technology about the viruses and the vaccines. And Trump puts in the travel ban at the end of January, the 29th, and then somehow these Chinese postdocs that are going back and forth from Wuhan get to come into the country, into Omaha. Now, the only way that can happen if there's a travel ban is if there's some superseding diplomatic card that they can play and show to say, no, wave them through. And the only people who I can think of have that kind of power is the military, is the DOD. And specifically in Omaha is STRATCOM, which is the Strategic Air Command, that's the one that why he flew from Florida during 9/11. That's why he flew to Omaha. And
yeah.
they can.
I would just add something to the, I don't mean to sort of interrupt you, but it just a quick interjection, George, because I think
Sure.
it's a crucial bit of information. But as they took out Soleimani in Iran, what else happened? Do you remember?
Well, that they shot the plane down, which I thought was loaded with the students that were going to be used as bioweapons or some other kind of retribution against Trump.
Yeah. So, or it could, you don't know where they fit into the scheme, but those were all postdocs, what would be considered the academic side of the equation, that where you try to make the science accountable, right? That's why we try to look after academia, and why I'm so peeved at what they've turned it into, by, well, one, going for low-hanging fruit, and two, the long march through the institutes of, Gramsci and his ideology, right? And you're seeing that played out because there was a paralysis at that level where I was just like, whoa, if these people who are sort of at the top, and we spoke last time about the Surgeon General, and you said he's got he was a fellow for Eli Lilly. They were his sponsor, okay, and then he's got into the Surgeon General position, and so I look at that role, okay, and my assumption would be Surgeon General, that implies a military role. He's got no military background. He's got ties to what would be called big pharma or vested interest research. So
Well, wait, let me just backtrack so I understand. When you say fellow, you're talking about his fellowship as a resident when he was
so.
earning his MD?
Yes.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Or
why
maybe it
would
was
he be?
postdoc. Maybe it was postdoc.
He's an MD. I don't think he's PhD. He's just MD.
Yeah, I thought he was MD. I didn't think he was MD PhD. So I'm just kind of curious, why did Eli Lilly sponsor a fellow for their residency? Why does any pharmaceutical company do that? Unless they were like, because he's a minority, they had a fund for minorities to sponsor, fellows.
Yeah, but so
I can see that.
So why do you think they did that? And all those programs were hijacked from the start, and that's why I just plainly call out. I'm like, that's a diversity hire. When they've pulled people into situations where you need commanders that can make command decisions, and those aren't there, and you've got snakes vying for the pole out the pit.
Well, does Eli Lilly have a vaccine program?
Of course.
Yeah.
They do? I mean,
yeah.
Of course.
And Azar is the HHS secretary, so he has budget and whatnot. And CDC falls under HHS. So it's fairly important to have a compliant U.S. Surgeon General, because he could shut down for instance, there's all sorts of limitations on bioweapons research supposedly that's supposed to happen at Fort Detrick. And we had all kinds of things go wrong at Fort Detrick. And so it's nice to have somebody over there kind of like not being the most compliance driven person. And that's the story of Jerome Adams. I can't remember what his first name is.
Jerome. I was confusing with the boxer, but like I say, I looked at that and I was just like, okay, the diversity hiring has just gone way too out of bounds, and that's just made me get off my ass. So, well, if I'm got to do something, at least I can sort of speak to this somewhat intelligently from a scientific perspective. But
Kevin, can I ask you a question, Kev?
Sure.
Because what I do is I follow if Bavari's going to leave Fort Detrick with all the vials in his pocket, and he's going to go start startups, he's not going to do vaccines for things he doesn't know are going to be the viruses. So he's going to go into treatments that he knows are going to be the answer to the test, right? So, and one of them is this nanotechnology, these nanobodies. And, I don't know if people know the story, but, antibody has two heavy chains, the binding areas, and two light chains. Well, there's these nanobodies that are found only in a couple of species that have only the two heavy chains. They're half the size of regular antibodies. but they still have all the binding affinity that the heavy chains for the antibodies have. And they were found in just a couple of years ago in camels and sharks, and then llamas of all things. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, because these are smaller molecules, could they use that binding affinity to cross the blood-brain barrier and to do something neurological?
Potentially, I'm going to say I would just go with the axiom that the brain, the central nervous system, is a immunoprivileged region. If there would have to be something radically different about a llama, camel, and shark vertebrate anatomy to be especially worried about that. My major concern is, if we're running around right now, and we're suddenly everyone's playing spy versus spy, then there's much more. The research that was done in the Cold War, right, is enough for us to, start being very surgical with how we're or how we use these agents. So the best example.
Well, can we just backtrack just the physiology of this? My understanding with MS is that you can get a pathogen, you develop an antibody against the pathogen, but the antibody is so similar to the myelin sheath in the central nervous system that it'll start to degrade the central nervous system, that myelin sheath. So if that is true, then the antibodies must be because it's a central nervous system disease.
Yeah, but it starts peripherally, right? So that people sort of lose feeling, and it sort of works its way in. It's like a neuropathy.
But my understanding was that the antibodies that are created outside of the cerebral fluid get actually into the brain. So antibodies
it's breaking down though in multiple sclerosis, right? So there's an attack coming from. It's not going directly into. It's not like the virus particle itself.
No. It's the antibody. It's the antibodies that are destroyed. But my point is that the antibodies are created outside of the central nervous system because the pathogen is outside the central nervous system. But then the antibodies that are created actually go through the blood-brain barrier and start to attack the myelin sheath.
Yeah. So
in the central nervous system. So my understanding was for MS as a disease model, that antibodies produced outside of the brain actually get into the brain through the blood-brain barrier.
It's an autoimmune disorder, and my understanding of it was that it's a peripheral disorder first, and then works its way into the central nervous system.
Right. So those antibodies that are attacking the myelin sheath in the central nervous system, it's
peripheral nervous system, right? So once it's attacking the myelin there and the axon, right? The axon itself, right, goes back, and you could basically think of like hollowing out a drainage pipe, right? So once that atrophies, where that would come out, the fiber bundle from the spinal cord, that then becomes a leaky barrier, right?
But the gliosis, these scarrings are taking place in the brain. And not in the peripheral nervous system.
It works,
but I mean, the point here is that this is the question. Is it the antibody that's created outside of the central nervous system going through the blood-brain barrier, or is MS associated immune disorders, autoimmune disorders, are the antibodies being created inside the central nervous system?
They're not inside the brain, right?
But I know that they attack the myelin sheath.
But it's not. It's coming. So the bone marrow is where your immune system basically emerges from.
It starts there, and then it matures.
And then it's going into.
It's maturing in the lymph nodes. But then there's memory T cells and stuff like this. So my understanding of immunology related to MS was that it was antibodies created outside the central nervous system that eventually gets into the central nervous system and starts to attack
Yeah, but I would just
neurons in the brain.
Yeah, I would add the caveat to that it's an attack on the peripheral nervous system. But the peripheral nervous system is just connected to the central nervous system. We just class it differently as at the dorsal root ganglion in the spinal cord, right? And that's you have to get past into that region.
Well, I mean, you have CMT and you have GBS. Those are all peripheral nervous system disorders. But MS is classified as a central nervous system disorder, not a peripheral nervous system disorder. So because of that, that means to me that the antibodies are crossing the blood-brain barrier.
Yeah, so I would make the argument that if you tracked it back, first there's the hypothesis that it could just be viral agents doing it, the multiple sclerosis. So we know that there's this neurotrophic component to
oh, that's a good point. That's a good point, that the virus is crossing the blood-brain barrier. You're getting an immune response from the glia cells, and and eventually it's attacking the myelin sheath from the central nervous system. That's a good point. Okay, all right.
So
okay, go on.
Well, either one that's true. It means that it's getting to the brain. Spina bifida comes to mind, polio, all these other viruses that have neurological effects. Alzheimer's is another myelin sheath disorder. So I'm thinking that if I was doing the bioweapon, you've got all these great. I look at it from like Dr. Bavari's point of view. I've got all these great bioweapons. And I want to be able to aerosolize them. That's the first thing. So coronavirus is my vector, okay? And then the second thing is, what's my biggest barrier to making this a more effective weapon? It's the triple B. It's the blood-brain barrier, right? So anything I can do to attack that construct as a functional unit is I'm interested, right? And I'm sorry I'm talking like a bioweapons guy, but this is how they talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have like a fence post, as Kevin likes to call it, when people are grabbing the fence post when they're seizing from this coronavirus. This is the more lethal presentation. And if you think of one hand is sort of the astrocyte foot on the blood vessel. If the fence post is a blood vessel, the astrocyte feet go around the blood vessel, and then the other one is the parasite, right? And in between those little gaps between your thumbs and fingers around the fence post is where the action is. That's the junction. And if you think about what's in coronavirus, it's angiotensin to relax the blood vessels, to make them more porous. It's moving toward hey, we'll be able to get all kinds of stuff through here. Let's see what we can fit through the door.
And I would just add on to that as a caveat. Look at the size of the genome of this virus and compare
It's 30,000 nucleotides roughly.
Right.
It's big, right?
Yeah.
Compare it to HIV.
Right, which is only like 3,000 or something like that.
I think it's a bit more than that, 10, I want to say, maybe. But like
really?
a third, I would say it's
okay.
It's still substantial.
Or maybe, okay, all right.
So I think what AIDS can pack into it as a little viral construct, and then they say, well, we've got all this space inside this capsid. What do we fill it with, right? And usually there's some sort of filler material. It seems to be like some lipid. So you just start swapping out the lipid for more gene sequence of bits that you want to that maybe people would and wouldn't recognize, but
what's your take on this? And I don't have an opinion, all right, of it, but at least what we were taught in school, not that it's right, but at least we were taught in school that HIV was zoonotic, all right? But then when you listen to Dr. Judy Mikovits, that there were elements that were somewhat designed. I mean, are we dealing with a group of people that made HIV? Or at least what we call HIV-1? Or do you really think that he just
Well,
emerged
the Soviets certainly thought so, and they said so publicly, and they called it Project Infection. I tend to shy away from those theories, but I do think that they are transfecting at a rapid rate, accelerating nature by a factor of 1 million at least. You know, how do you get the pig's AIDS into the bat coronavirus, or how do you get the bat coronavirus? You know, yeah, it could happen, but if I keep transfecting it all day long and I have these robotic machines that do 1,000 assays in 10 minutes, it's a lot quicker. So whether it's zoonotic, I'm saying it's zoonotic. It's just automated zoonotic.
Right. So let's so the listeners understand this. When I say zoonotic, I mean in
You mean by accident, by nature?
In nature, all right.
Yeah.
But then there is the ability to just keep on transfecting in a lab until you get what you're looking for. All right. I consider that as at least one way in the bioengineered world to do something. So I would not consider that zoonotic. I would consider that bioengineered. Then you can start getting into the manipulation of the genome with CRISPR or some other technology. That's another level of bioengineering.
Right.
So, you know, just transfecting to get this Mendelian transfection kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. You went out, Paul. I can't see your picture anymore.
Yeah. I just had a call that came through. But
okay.
So basically, you know, I view that transfecting of animals, you know, at a high throughput as a bioengineering technique, not a zoonotic technique. And I think the scientific community has a tendency to view that technique as a zoonotic technique, which it's not, because it's not a natural process. We are manipulating, we're speeding up that process.
So I would just put it in these terms, right? As you're lining up PhD students and you're saying, basically you'll be saying, we're interested in what this serine, whatever sequence does in the genome, right? And you basically just set PhD students to work on that, right? And just see, and they will look and they will study, and there'll be a whole bunch of metrics that they have to quantify, and that can be a whole PhD, right? Just changing and tweaking one thing, right? And maybe the PhD doesn't even really fully understand the end goal, okay, because they're still learning, right? And that's often how the academic environment is. You get cheap slave labor in the form of students who are often highly motivated and work for very, very little.
Yeah, it's very compartmentalized, and Dr. Judy Mikovits from Fort Detrick mentions that, where they told her, you're attenuating the virus. When you're transfecting, we're trying to come up with a vaccine. When you're doing all this transfection, we're trying to develop a biodefense. But in actual fact, they're developing new viruses that could be used and amplified later as bioweapons. And you think of the Korean War, this is why I go back to the cults, because if you look at the people who are the basic funders of the WHO, going all the way back to Japan, Japan's bioweapons program in World War II, Lab 731, went straight into a whole bunch of joint ventures with army generals and the top elite in Japan, and they started immediately using bioweapons of every type in Korea. It was like maybe there was a year pause to load the tanks up, but they tried dropping it from airplanes. And the problem they had with using mosquitoes or fleas or whatever as the vector is that a lot of times wind and all kinds of unpredictable things, and they found out that the human vector was the best way to go, because the human vector can go right up to somebody and spray somebody with a newspaper, right? And hide the weapon. And it could be a young little girl that looks like she's collecting signatures for her church. And then these people, like you were saying, Kevin, I watched the film, they were just dropping dead. Like they didn't even have time to go over, sit next to a wall, let alone make a cell phone call. They were just dropping like flies. you know, and
go on, go on.
well, I was
I
just
mean,
going to say, when you told me that, and then I saw that, you know, there's neurological effects, and I saw that, I said, something's going on here. This is a neurological agent as well that they're covering. This is not just a safe virus that gives you the sniffles, or sometimes you don't even realize you were infected, supposedly. It's not the safe strain. They're also testing a lethal strain of something.
And so that would
well, there's clinical presentations that are starting to, you know, to be a little bit more common. I wouldn't say common, but they're becoming more prevalent.
Patent.
Well, no, they're a pattern where you're getting the tingling in the leg. So that's a signal that peripheral nervous system is getting affected, you know, and maybe possibly through this mechanism of antibodies being produced or trying to be produced that actually are causing an autoimmune disorder.
And Kevin would know the answer to this, but like around the olfactory bulb and well, just around the inner core, there's a circumvention loop that doesn't require you to travel through the blood-brain barrier. So I'm pretty sure most bioweapons use the circumvention loop to affect, like you were saying, nucleus accumbens and all the stuff at the base of the brain, pituitary gland, all that, you know, reptilian ancestry brain. I'd be interested to hear your comment there.
I mean, I'll go on record as saying that's the first thing I noticed, because just of the types of behavior, I've seen it replicated in primates when targeting those regions. And that's just at a basic level, that just comes from disinhibition. So disinhibition just means it's going to get more excited, because, you know, the brain goes to a lot of work. A lot of the energy used in the brain is to dampen it so it doesn't get out of control and go into seizure states. And seizure is actually a really complex state of the brain. And, you know, there's very obvious ones, but there are, you know, seizures were a problem for me after I hit my head, and more like at night with sort of, because at night electrical activity sweeps backwards and forwards, like in big, large waves. And I would wake up in the night and sort of, it's called like dystonic contracture. And, you know, that type of, that's like a physical assault to the brain, blunt force trauma. But that creates something called central sensitization. Okay. And it just means that the brain becomes hyper excitable. Glutamate excitotoxicity. Glutamate is neurotoxic. Okay. So if you want to, there are agents that you can inject into the brain.
Well, don't they just give GABA?
No. So the way I would do it, so GABA is like your dampening system. And a lot of the brain, the subcortical regions have very large GABAergic networks, and glutamate is, I would argue, more sort of cortical distribution. And then there's a sort of the basal nuclei basically allow, when they quieten down, essentially they allow the cortex to ramp up, and that's what we think of as the correlate of the behavior. So the simplest way to think about it is moving. So if I'm looking at my cup, I want to reach the cup, pick the cup up, and not reach for the camera, right? And that's when you think about the sort of planning and trajectory and all the muscles involved and all these, there's, when you start breaking it down, you suddenly like, oh well, that's all happening in, you know, fractions.
Well, that's the dealing with the pathway 1, pathway 2 for the dopamine to be able to control, to be able to do motor control.
Yeah, so it's indirect, direct. I mean, they just keep coming up with more pathways, and
Well, Kevin, here's my question to you though, but because these people didn't even have time to get their phone out of their pocket before they collapsed. So to me, it's something like an anthrax or, you know, strychnine takes longer, and I think anthrax, if the Krebs cycle, not the Krebs cycle, if the ATP cycle was a clock, it's like jamming the clock at 2 o'clock. I think somewhere between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the cycle.
That is Krebs cycle.
It is Krebs cycle. Yeah.
And look, all I would say is it looked like there was in those cases where they're just face planting down and going into seizure. That to me is essentially, I would say, like a medullary type response, right? So brainstem, cerebellar, deep cerebellar nuclei are probably involved, and it probably just comes on like you probably feel a bit nauseous, headache, and depending on its replication rate and the transsynaptic virulence, right? So you want it. So is it just bursting the first cell, lysing, and then just going out, or is it sort of more limited in its expression along an axon to where it gets to the synapse and then jumps? And so in the case of rabies, it's a kind of mixture of both. But once you're jumping one synapse, then you get into the next level of the network, and that branches out. And then once you get to the synapse after that, basically the whole system.
See, my just observation of this, if it is a slow, if they were infected and then hours later or days later they have this, then I would think that it has something to do with viral load and lysing of the cells. But if they get it and then minutes later, they have this clinical presentation, they fall and start seizuring. It seems to me that's more that there's a toxic, there's some sort of chemical component to this. This sounds more
a neurotoxin, like
like a neurotoxin, right.
And see, if you wanted to create a worldwide scare and you wanted to film bodies all over the street, you could have your comfort girls from the Sinjan Chi or wherever, spray some people at random, and they're not even getting their phone out. They can't even sitting down. They're not even sitting down. They're just falling right straight in the street. So,
so it can't be a viral load. It can't be viral load for these, for these quick death type situations, because it takes so much time to actually replicate the virus.
Right.
Yes.
So it has to be some sort of neurotoxin.
I would say let's keep in mind that there's a spectrum of response here as well, and we're only looking often at sort of grainy CCTV footage. But you've seen the face planters and they're going into seizure, but they're also often sort of foaming and coughing out and their reports are like thick pink sputum coming up, which seems to be linked to the breakdown of the epithelial lining. But again, we're going off very, very minimal observational data. It was only the type of response that said to me, oh, that's neural, rather than something like a anaphylactic shock you get with like peanut allergy, right? Where you just swell up and you can't breathe, and that sort of just chokes you out. You don't get the grand mal type seizure, right? And so that indicates that there's the neural event. And even that, it's difficult for me to say, oh, that's one thing or the other. What I can say I'm convinced of was the contamination behavior, the Tourette-like behavior of spitting and wiping saliva, and we're just catching glimpses, right? Licking windows, mirrors.
Because I was looking at from the cardiac side, where it's like rapid blood pressure reduction, not being able to control the blood pressure. So I was thinking it was infecting.
Those areas are in the medulla as well. That controls
the
heart rate. Okay.
Right. So I was thinking that it was, an infection of the brainstem. Something that was going into the brainstem and affecting the brainstem.
And that's one way through the phrenic nerve, and you could also go through the vagal nerve. And there's, in more chronic disorders, there's something called BRAC staging, which is a sort of hypothesis that gets bandied around, and I think there's some merit to it, where and there's a distinction in the neurological realm as we try to classify disorders, and we say, okay, it's what we call Lewy body disorders, and those Lewy body disorders can range from Alzheimer's to Parkinson's to multi-system atrophy. It just depends on the discrete pathways it takes and how what appears to be the breakdown of the actin-myosin framework within the microtubulin framework, and that metabolism that begins to tangle up and then breaks up the clearance from the cell, and then where it deposits those tangles of protein is how they begin to classify disorders, right? So I want to say, and this is me just going off the top of my head, so a key factor is iron metabolism, especially as the brain ages. Brain accumulates iron, that then starts messing with well, you know, it's not fully understood how that's, you know, what those interactions are, but the body works very hard to maintain iron in very functional format. It doesn't want iron just floating about because it's dangerous ion to have, right? And so there's a lot of so like the blood is cycled about I want to say every 2 months. You know, you're putting out new red blood cells, and that all that breakdown of the iron and the hemoglobin and is it's a huge area where things go wrong, and there's a huge area of medicine where you could get into it and
Kevin, I'm glad you mentioned this, because if you think of ferritin, you're talking about ferritin as the storage mechanism. I always thought of ferritin as kind of like a piggy bank, and you put hemoglobin into it. I know this is, let's just say O2. You just put the O2 in. I think it can hold up to about 4,000, and it's maintaining your homeostasis, releasing a little bit and absorbing depending. But if you were able to attack ferritin, like you're saying, with a whole bunch of, and just have an iron overload, and there was a way to get through the blood-brain barrier, and you flood the free radical iron, and because I go back to this presentation of this guy who saw a clump in the brain in the CT scan, and this doctor, and then he goes in to start looking at it and carving it out, and he says the thing is coagulating, it's clotting real time in front of his face. And I'm like, well, wow,
there is a skin disorder that is related, all right, and so Schomburg syndrome is something where your blood, you're not getting really good blood flow in your legs. So dermatologists will start seeing individual Schomburg syndrome where the blood vessels will burst, and you'll start having this like little micro bleeding right at the surface of your skin, and it'll have these little flakes. It's the iron that's in
this
in
is
your
the
blood.
stipulation. This is the stipples that people talk about.
Yeah, maybe.
Kevin,
I'm not even talking about this COVID.
I'm just checking right now. So
I'm not even talking about COVID-19. I'm just talking about just dermatology in general. Through Schomburg. So the blood cell will burst, and it'll release all this iron. So it takes a while for that iron to go away. Those little flakes. So you'll have like bruise. It'll look like a bruise.
Yeah. Yeah, and the little stipples or whatever they're called are formed because iron is sort of acting like an iron filings magnet kind of thing, on a smaller scale. Yeah. I do think iron is at the center.
So I think what my point here is, I think what's happening because of the ACE2 receptor, that's in the lining of some of these capillaries, that you're going to have this leak. You'll have this like a vascular leaking that's taking place, and the bursting of these red blood cells, and then you're going to have this accumulation of iron. In the brain. Yeah,
so that's my concern, right? So blood is in the brain, right? It's just
Right.
it's a very complex system of flow and exchange of metabolites, and and I haven't seen it beyond theory, but if there's some displacement of the heme molecule that's the virus is somehow attacking red blood cells, it's sort of taken as not gospel, but there's the idea that it can bind to T2 cells, so very probably it's binding to red blood cells. That's messing with the iron metabolism, and you have to just think, so where is that happening? So I would say, so if you look at that Schamberg disease, and say this example I've got is just looking at the feet, and it looks like it's occurring around the ankle, so that's where the blood is pooling, and I would say that's a sort of leaky.
It happens to areas where there's poor circulation, and then you get this micro bleeding that takes place.
Yeah, so I guess it's just sort of bursting out from
it bursts, right? And then as the red blood cells start to get filtered out from the interstitial tissue, the iron remains. It takes a longer time to filter that out.
So I would say that's a workable hypothesis then too. So there's monkey studies that have come out right now, and they need to be doing the histology on the brains of those animals, and a quick way that they could be doing it is just doing MRI on the brain and just seeing if there's deep hypointensities. So and areas that get hypointensities with iron dysregulation are the cerebellum and the basal ganglia again, right? And if suddenly you're seeing, and that's considered part of the degenerative cycle that sort of occurs across the lifetime of an individual, and there's compensation built into the network, okay, and then that's supposed to sort of get you through there's only so long you're going to live, right? You can't live forever, right? It's not biologically feasible, and you wouldn't want to live forever, right?
Why not? Why not?
Don't tell that to Kissinger. Kissinger would disagree. He's got half the Rockefeller Institute working on that.
He must get blood transfusions a day, every day.
Oh, look, right? They know that juvenile blood is regenerative, right? It's not a new thing.
Right.
The
vampirism is real. That's a strange thing. It's real.
Can I just comment on, Paul, on the stipulated cell, the stipulated heme, the blood vessel, a blood cell. If it did get to the blood-brain barrier and it wasn't a fragility, it didn't have the strength. It was a fragile red blood cell, and it did burst. Part of the stuff that would be leaking would go through the blood-brain barrier because it's a smaller, whatever's in the cell, the cytoplasm of the cell would potentially get through the triple B, and that would deliver the virus.
Well, you would have, right.
In the interstitial fluid, or whatever they call that fluid, the CNS or whatever, it would deliver the virus
that's one method. That there are particles in the blood that can go through the blood-brain barrier, but it could be even better. The virus could infect the red blood cell, and that red blood cell is filtering into the blood, or filtering into the brain before it bursts.
But in order for there to be a neurological presentation, it would seem, and rather than a systemic presentation, it seems like your theory of it crossing the triple B would have to be in effect. Right. And like Kevin says, there's a rabies-like thing where it's like a growing weed in a garden where it infiltrates everything. And all of a sudden, one day you reach a break-even point and you just crash. I think there's maybe possibly two vectors that's happening for the neurological presentation before it's presenting itself in the lung. It's possible that it's going through this olfactory.
mechanism that we've already talked about.
Yeah, yeah.
But
That's the one.
another possibility is that the red blood cell is getting infected before the AT2 cells in the air sac, or at least they're getting infected at a higher rate. And then as those red blood cells are infected, it's circulating into the brain. They lyse, and then what happens is now you've released viral product into brain tissue. So, or you could have it lyse in the bloodstream before it gets to the brain, and that product is floating around in the bloodstream and it goes through the blood-brain barrier. But I think it's more probable that it's the red blood cell that's been infected that gets through the blood-brain barrier, lyses, and then it starts to infect. That, that's the pathway that's not using the olfactory pathway.
Yes, so these are every mechanism described there. I would just say, yep, that needs testing. And right now, instead of just letting it run riot in across populations, and instead of handing over the tactical advantage to the Chinese, who will not, or they don't mind running it across their population, and they'll sacrifice thousands of monkeys in the process to get an insight into this agent that probably would take us much longer. We're getting much better data now, clinically, but my worry is that because we let the kiddies run the or let the kiddies drive the car, we're not in control. I mean, it will take time to ramp up studies where you need to model the disorder in an organism as close as possible, right? So today, is it today? Oh, it sort of flashed across my thing. So basically, the story was Oxford have tried to come up with a vaccine, and I think it was 4 subjects, and basically there was news going around that one of the subjects died already. She died within hours of getting the vaccine, and but it's not true, right? This is just how this is what I'm saying, right? You've got to understand what people will see that, and there are people who will just put an extra pound of pressure on that trigger that they've got, right? And they will not, and couple that with the fact that you're disinhibiting those limbic networks, just adds for way more chaos into this system than people are giving credence to right now. Okay, and my concern has been the
See, my concern is this: that if we've had SARS for years, a decade or more, and then we haven't had a vaccine, at least presented to the public, how could they come in record timing, come up with a vaccine for COVID-19? So I mean, I don't believe it unless they had a vaccine already and they never wanted to release it to the public.
So
I'm on the fence on that. I don't know, but
the disturbing thing about this vaccine is it's from a chimpanzee, and it's called a I have to find it. But
Are you saying the Oxford vaccine is yeah.
So it's a the word is escaping me right now. I'll find it. You can sort of. But
what is it? Some sort of attenuated virus?
It's
vaccine,
a virus that they use.
What kind of vaccine is it?
So it's a virus, a chimpanzee virus, and let me get the type of virus it is because it's important. It begins with A, and it's just on the tip of my tongue right now.
It sounds like attenuated virus.
No.
Well, I know there's there's like 8 classes of viruses: and alpha virus, beta virus, gamma virus, and then filovirus and retrovirus. All those.
Right.
I can't, the Baltimore scale, but I'm going back 20 years now, so
Well, I mean,
It's
there's different types of viruses, but there's also different types of vaccines. So the question is what kind of vaccine are they
so
using?
it's
Are they
it's a,
using
it's a
an
modified.
attenuated?
No, it's
Are they using a
partially.
conjugated? Are they using an inactivated
It's
vaccine?
an mRNA sequence for the ACE2
mRNA.
receptor.
Yeah, yeah. So this is
So
the it sounds like the mRNA platform that I'm scared
yes,
about. This is the Fauci thing.
but this
This
is
is what
from the.
Fauci's pushing. It's
No, this
just
is,
it's not through Moderna. It's through Oxford. But the problem here is that messenger RNA platform is scary because you can sneak something in.
yeah, and it's chimpanzee one, right? And
Yeah.
this is
And you don't know, you don't know what other biological products may
yeah.
be introduced into the human organism when you're doing that. You're going to have you may be infecting individuals with something even what kind of cell line are they pushing this through? The kidney?
I know it's from a chimpanzee, and I will get it. Adenovirus, maybe that's what it's called. It's a particular type of virus. It's been used in the neurosciences a lot, and it's used in genetic therapies because it's considered a relatively benign virus that you can load
Yeah.
up with a genetic package. And
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
coronavirus is used to be benign too.
Well, adenovirus, if you wanted to put in a fluorescent, for certain experiments, you use an adenovirus as your vector.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's like Kevin says, it's kind of a known way of lighting something up in an experiment, or if you want to put in a different compound and get it into an organism.
And it's not the mRNA bit that bothers me, it's the chimpanzee bit, right? And that's, it's all very well tinkering with these things, but it needs to be controlled. And right now I want troops of chimpanzees to be getting this vaccine, and the same with um, macaques, right? We know there's a species differentiation with the
Hey,
current
George,
SARS.
this is the shared URL.
Oh, okay. You got it. Okay. BioNTech and Pfizer. Hey, there's our Pfizer. See, it's easier to follow the money. There we go. We got the Fauci solution, BioNTech. Well done, Kevin.
well done, the hive mind. It's just people feeding me. Basically, all my time now just goes into trying to just keep up with information that people are giving me. And look, a lot just slips by me, right? I can't do anything. The advantage I have right now is just being able to point out the neurological aspect to it, because we let the work or the research side slip so much in the West that I was literally the only one left in the world doing it, right? And that put me in a position to be able to sort of give a heads up. I got my kids out of school real quick, and it just made me say, okay, this is not we're not in Kansas anymore, right? And you need to be we need to be careful, and proper study needs to be doing, and the West needs to just get over its squeamishness, and the kids and the whining simps just need to be told to sit down and have a nice cup of shut the fuck up, in my mind, until we get the experiments done.
Right.
That's what needs to be done. And at the same time, these all these what are not, they don't have they have conflicts of interest with the research. Okay, so that research in my mind becomes sketchy already, right? Because you don't know what their motivations are when there's so much money on the line, right? And wheels will have been greased, and the next generation will be primed for coming through. And in the West, I'm sorry, but when we put our chips in with gene chips and rodents, we messed up, right? Big time. And now we're going to see the consequences of that, because there aren't enough researchers with the neuroscience experience at the primate level to understand the disruptions in those networks.
Well, I've got a headline here. I agree with you. There's not the infrastructure to do kind of a Manhattan project on this, but they're calling for a Manhattan project. I say do it in silico first, or in parallel.
You do everything in parallel.
Yeah, everything. But what I was saying is Dr. Shiva already has a triple B model in a meth model, and he's already got an interferon model. And so, hey, let's do an interleukin model. Let's get this thing rolling. But here's the article that came out within 19 hours ago about how they're announcing the timeline already for rollout, even though the person died, I guess.
No, they didn't die. They didn't die.
Oh, they didn't die. Okay.
No.
So what is the timeline? What are they saying?
So it says around 1,110 people. That has some meaning to some people out there. Will be a part of the cohort. Dr. Professor Sarah Gilbert will be leading the Oxford vaccine team. She says she's 80% confident. 80%. Was Bill Gates 80% confident on the rubella vaccine for India? I guess that means 80% of the people live. But anyway, the vaccine's been made from a weakened version of the cold virus that causes infections in chimpanzees. It's be modified so that it'll be impossible to grow in humans. And right there, I'm like, well, looking at all the growth factors, aren't those exactly the same from humans to chimpanzees? Isn't that why we use chimpanzees as a analog to?
There's very little. I mean, they did chimpanzee models with HIV research. There was some. They basically found a model that sort of caused an acute crash in chimpanzees, and so chimpanzees were kept around, but they were released, and like I say, all that infrastructure was dismantled years ago, right? I watched it, and I watched people who were handed this treasure to sort of pass on and look after, all just capitulated to money and special interest groups. They're just weak individuals. And
I dealt with two different monkey labs. One was in Oregon and one was in University of Washington. So there used to be monkey labs all over the place. And
there still is.
There still is
centers, but they tend to be more geared towards. Of course, there's macaque models being used, right? It is still a gold standard, but it's orders of magnitude smaller now than it was 20, 30 years ago, right? But at the same time, the Japanese have centers with thousands of monkeys at their disposal, right? Under advanced monitoring techniques and without the ethical limitations to do what we would do. So the fact that they've come
The
out
Japanese or the Chinese?
Chinese.
Oh, you said
yeah.
Japanese. But okay.
Did I? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
They all look the same.
Yeah. Now I know you're kidding. So don't get me in trouble here. I'll have CNN, Connie Chung calling me.
Yeah, it won't matter what we say about bioweapons or anything. It would just be,
You're right.
just be the implied racism from
right. Which
we
obviously are not that way at all, and we're all good people.
They got us into this mess, right?
Well, the joint ventures, I say the joint ventures got us into this mess, but I think we're maybe spokes on the same wheel here. We're pretty close to the locus of what the answer is. And so I think it's going to be a higher pay grade from here on in with me with this conversation, because I need to go do a whole bunch of study now to be able to converse with you now. But Paul, what do you think about this as just being good for installment one? And then we'll come back and do it again after we can have some study time, because I don't want to go too far over my skis. You know what I mean?
I understand. And that's the purpose of this is to inform the public also to, do their own research and to, learn as we're learning. We're in real time. That's why I keep on saying we're on the battlefield and there's a fog of war and we're simulating and we're thinking in real time as we're talking about these things, and we all have a part to play. So I mean, I'm for that. So
I would just say what I think would be useful right now is if someone's listening that is nailed on virologist, biochemist in that domain, we tend to conjecture a bit too much about possible mechanisms when someone with hands-on experience is going to say, well, I would do XYZ, right? So I can speak to the brain and what I would do and what I would expect to see, but I'm just playing best guess in the.
Well, this is the interesting thing about science, and when you're trying to understand the unknown, is that you're going to be looking at so many different possible pathways. 90% of them are going to be wrong.
Yep.
All right, but there's going to be a few out there that are right on target. And that's why people need to talk about this.
Yeah, they would be trying to come up with a vaccine at Oxford if they had it already, right? Or maybe it's already in the can, but
it's in the can. I absolutely guarantee you this is an in silico preparation that they've said, okay, we've got the chimpanzee vector. They know the adenovirus is supposedly relatively benign.
See, I really thought it was going to be a distributed bio that was going to come out with their.
Well, there's
antibody.
a shotgun. Their approach is just shotgun take 100 soldiers or 100 patients, infected patients, antigens, and spin it down for their antigens and just inject it as one big superhuman virus or superhuman vaccine. That's kind of like, we'll throw everything at the whiteboard and see what sticks. We used to have sales presentations like that, whatever the customer lights up with, and it seems like a very brute force and ignorance method, but I'll just leave it there. I need to go study now and catch up with you guys.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So, so as we part, is there anything that the listeners are listening to this broadcast that you would like them to know, George?
Well, I would just say this. I mean, I do news, and so I do the news angle, so I get to play scientist here because it reminds me of the AIDS fight 30 years ago. But really support these guys. These are scientists that are going away from their thesis in Paul's case, going away from his profession in Kevin's case, and who you have to have somebody out there socializing this and talking about it, because right now it's a complete dead wire. Right now we're not getting any information. There's nobody talking like this. You're the only game in town. Maybe the one-eyed blind man is king, and the one-eyed man is king. But that's the way it is until we get more information. Right? That's the way it is. And so you're performing an incredibly important service. And I would just say, go to Kevin's Patreon, go to your Patreon, and support these guys.
I appreciate that, George.
Yep. That would
and Dr. McCairn?
I would just say right now that, my office door is open and the ports are open, and anyone that wants to come, I'm firing off a lot of rounds at individual people that want questions answered on YouTube. But I need to be speaking to other audiences, and I think my concern right now is the non-compliance, which is already happening in the US, right? They've shown you their intent by arresting the wife of a police officer in Ohio, and you don't want to be the trench troops walking into no man's land. You've got to get your headspace and get forced to reality. So you've got Overwatch, and you're putting a different angle onto the battle that's going on, and that's always my approach. And where I see what looks like classic gain of function of social media. I was going to say, but it's probably a stupid analogy, but it's just classic astroturfing, like these movements that are springing up, right? I would be very, very suspicious of the people doing them and their intention, because I don't see it that much as an organic, like the talking points are the same, the boards are all the same. There's and then there's two sides playing, right? That's my concern. And they're people that are agents of chaos, right? That's what they want. And like I say, everything's in flux, and you just got to see what comes down. And that's the whole point of having QRF on a battlefield, so you can respond in as real time as possible. Mm-hmm. And you give them autonomy to make decisions. And that's kind of what's happened with these medical institutions and science research institutions, and you've given them power. And we've seen what happens with that power, because one, they comply under one situation, like the under Obama, they said no more gain of function research. That's it, we're done. And then you get the catastrophe, which is funding your ideological enemies, right?
But this battle will continue. This war will continue, and that's why we call it the coronavirus war room. And
Paul, I'll say this: Kevin's dad worked for the Quick Reaction Force in the UK with all those our response to this Cold War. So we're picking up in your dad's footsteps, Kevin. What do you think?
Well, I think he would be, I don't know, smart. He'd just be gearing up. That's what they do, just on a moment's notice. And,
we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there.
Okay, so this concludes our very first episode of Coronavirus War Room. So I appreciate your help with providing very valuable information that people will take this and continue on the research. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Just hit like, subscribe, go and spread it out. And last message: get those people saying there's no virus, right? I'm not saying don't go and not comply, or if you're going to get into the non-compliance thing, but don't go around saying there's no virus, right? You'll just get shot down, pulled down real quick.
Right.
Right. Oh, in Maryland, all we want to be able to do is go out on our boat, where we're going to be two people that are completely by ourselves. That's the thing, is it's not a one size fits all. You can't use your boat. It's like if I was saying I want to go to a group of 50 people and I want to be able to cough in all directions, that's one thing. But to say I just want to go out on the Chesapeake or the Potomac, is different. Yeah. So
I just want to build a pirate ship and go down the Potomac.
Well, I got one. All right.
But before you go, let me just hit stop the recording here.
Okay.